Good morning. I want to thank everyone for being here today. It is wonderful to see such a good turnout, especially in view of the flying weather, for returning to the capital city. It took me over 12 hours yesterday and 2 more for my luggage. So I want to thank you to those who are watching through our live stream, as well as those individuals who submitted questions for our panelists through social media. Over the weekend, we will try to get through as many questions as possible. I also want to thank each of our panelists who made the commitment to be here today, and they too, I'm sure, suffered some travel inconveniences. I want them to share their invaluable perspectives on what many understand to be one of the greatest challenges facing our country and nations around the world. It is my hope that today will be just the first of a number of roundtables that we hold over the coming months. At a time when Americans are searching for solutions, we as their elected representatives need to do our part to foster an open discussion about the critical issues that are facing our country and its citizens. That is why I'm happy to invite both Democrats and Republicans to this conversation, as well as the public and press, so that we can all benefit from the insights of our panelists as we seek to identify clear paths forward in addressing the issue of climate change. Every day, millions of people in America and around the world are living through the increasingly devastating impacts of human-caused climate change. Our oceans are becoming more acidic, our coastlines are eroding, and we're enduring more frequent and severe storms, more severe drought, higher temperatures, and are at increased risk from changing patterns of vector-borne diseases. We know these changes are occurring because we can see them happening around us. We have some of the brightest scientific minds studying our planet, improving our understanding of Earth's changing climate, and identifying the increasing confidence the cause of these changes. We have exceptional guests today speaking on both panels, whom I know will spark great discussion amongst those of us here and those watching from home. On the first panel, which will focus on helping us understand the state of climate science and what we can anticipate going forward, we are fortunate to have 3 distinguished individuals. Dr. Ben Santer, a world-renowned atmospheric scientist currently working at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Dr. Phil Duffy, president of Woods Hole Research Center and former senior advisor to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And Dr. Bernard Goldstein, an environmental toxicologist from the University of Pittsburgh and former assistant administrator for research and development at EPA. On the second panel, we will be joined by 4 exceptional individuals who will discuss how best to mitigate climate change and deal with its impacts. And they include Dr. Christina Filgoris, an internationally renowned leader on global climate change, who served as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for 6 years, including during the Conference of Parties in Paris. She will be joining us remotely from Costa Rica. The Honorable David O'Sullivan, the European Union Ambassador to the United States. Dr. Jonathan Elkin, with Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy and former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at DOE. And Dr. Manish Bapna, the Executive Vice President of World Resources Institute. We're very fortunate to have each of them here today to share their expertise with us, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first panel for the introductory remarks, which will be followed by a question and answer and what I believe will be a very informative discussion. I hope in the meantime I'll be joined by some colleagues here. Dr. Santer, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. My name is Ben Santer. Since 1992, I have been a climate scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Today, I am not representing Lawrence Livermore. I traveled here at my own expense and am speaking as a private citizen. In the mid-1990s, I was the lead author on Chapter 8 of a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Our bottom line finding was this sentence, quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate," unquote. These 12 words changed the world. The IPCC report was published in early 1996. Soon thereafter, my role as lead author of Chapter 8 was the subject of congressional investigation. I spent several years of my life defending the discernible human influence finding. The buck stopped with me. After 1996, I was not just an individual scientist. I was a representative of the larger scientific community. I had to be accountable. I had to seek respectful dialogue with different stakeholders. I had to communicate complex science in plain English. I had to enter the public arena. Today, 21 years after the discernible human influence finding, the scientific evidence for human effects on global climate is overwhelming. The evidence has at least 4 different sources. The first is basic understanding of the heat-trapping properties of greenhouse gases. This understanding goes back several centuries. The second source is the evidence from paleoclimate data. Such deep time information reveals the unusual nature of recent climate change. The third source of evidence is in historical observations of temperature, rainfall, clouds, sea level, snow, sea ice, glaciers, and many other climate attributes. Observations tell an internally consistent story of large and rapid planetary warming. The last source of scientific evidence is from computer models of the climate system. In the real world, many different influences on climate vary simultaneously. With models, we can vary one thing at a time. This helps us to isolate the unique climate fingerprints of changes in the sun, volcanic activity, greenhouse gases, and other factors. The 1995 IPCC report did not have sufficient evidence to make confident statements about the relative sizes of human and natural influences on climate. Today, we do have enough evidence to make such statements. Human fingerprints have been detected from the top of Earth's atmosphere to the depths of the oceans. The most recent IPCC report, the 2013 report, reached this conclusion, quote, "It is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. We can no longer plead ignorance of the climatic consequences of our actions. There is, and will always be, some irreducible uncertainty in assessments of complex science. Climate scientists do not ignore these uncertainties. We try to identify and quantify uncertainties in models and in data. We routinely test claims that the climate system is not warming, or that it is warming, but the warming is solely due to natural causes. Such claims are mutually inconsistent. They are also inconsistent with reality. Let me say a few words about satellite data. In recent hearings, satellite temperature data were presented as Exhibit A in the case against global warming. In fact, satellite data show significant warming of the troposphere, the lowest level of Earth's atmosphere. Globally average, tropospheric warming is about 1.25 degrees Fahrenheit over the full 38 years of satellite temperature records. Warming of this size is highly unusual relative to our best estimates of natural climate variability. While there are normal decade-to-decade fluctuations in tropospheric temperature, there is no sign of, quote, leveling off, unquote, of warming over the last 18 to 20 years, as some have claimed. Our government is charged with keeping the people of the United States safe from harm. Human-caused climate change constitutes a real and serious form of harm, a clear and present danger to the lives, livelihoods, and health of the citizens of this country and the citizens of this planet. If our government fails to protect us from this harm, it will have failed to fulfill its most important responsibility to the American people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move quickly now to Dr. Duffy.
Ranking Member Johnson, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm Philip Duffy, President and Executive Director of the Woods Hole Research Center. Our work focuses primarily on the role of natural systems in climate change, both as contributors to the problem through, for example, greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and from thawing permafrost, and also as part of the solution through land management practices that remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in forests and soils. We work with countries, primarily in the developing world, to not only reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases, those that come from natural systems, but also to measure those greenhouse gas emissions. Both of these actions help those countries to meet their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. Before coming to Woods Hole, as you mentioned, I was a senior policy analyst in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I advised senior policymakers on a number of issues related to climate change, including priorities for global change research spending. In the next few minutes, I will explain what I view as among the most critical unanswered questions in climate science. Before discussing unanswered questions, however, I want to emphasize that we already understand enough to know, well beyond any reasonable doubt, that humanity needs to reduce dramatically and quickly its emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. As Dr. Santer just recounted, this has been known for probably 10 or 20 years. So, any discussion of unanswered questions should not be used as justification to delay or to scale back strong actions to mitigate climate change. Climate policies should be based on the imperative to avoid the worst potential outcomes from climate change. In my view, those worst outcomes are those that are most difficult to adapt to, those that once set in motion become impossible to control, those that result in major loss of life or major financial losses, and those that impose major costs on future generations who have no voice in the decisions that might prevent them. These worst outcomes include, firstly, sea level rise resulting from uncontrolled disintegration of major land ice sheets, that is Greenland or Antarctica. Second, large or uncontrollable emissions of greenhouse gases from thawing permafrost. And thirdly, disruptive increases in the frequency or intensity of extreme weather events. I want to emphasize that this is by no means an all-inclusive list of the potentially serious harms from climate change. Other potential serious impacts include large-scale agricultural failures and direct human health impacts. I give these less emphasis, however, because I believe that the risks from those particular harms is subject to mitigation by human ingenuity and resourcefulness. In other words, we can adapt to those risks better. Two of the most serious outcomes mentioned above, disintegration of major land ice sheets and greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost, may become unstoppable once a certain amount of warming, in other words, a threshold, is exceeded. Understanding where those warming thresholds are should be an urgent research priority, since climate policies, if they accomplish nothing else, should keep us clear of those thresholds. All of the most dire outcomes mentioned above are related, either directly or indirectly, to warming in the polar regions. With this in mind, we should increase efforts to investigate regionally focused policy options that would limit warming at the poles specifically, and thus reduce risk from consequences of polar warming. The options investigated should include so-called climate engineering. I'm not proposing that such measures be implemented, only that we should understand better how they might work in order to possibly give policymakers a greater range of options. I think it's fair to say that the consequences of climate change have appeared more ominous as we have learned more about them. Projections of future sea level rise, for example, have been revised upwards several times in recent years. Because of these trends in our understanding, the long-standing goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius has been increasingly supplanted by the stricter goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Meeting either of those goals is extremely difficult, and that difficulty increases every day that we do not take decisive action. In rough terms, to limit warming to 2 degrees C, we would need to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions by roughly half by mid-century and cease emissions altogether by the end of the century. On top of that, we would need to remove somewhere between 100 and 200 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere, and that's equivalent to about 10 to 20 years of global emissions at the present rate. And how to do that, I should point out, remains an open question. The difficulty of meeting these climate policy goals underscores the importance of refining the goals through better understanding of what it takes to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. In summary, our highest policy priority should be to avoid the most dire potential outcomes from climate change. Our highest research priority, therefore, should be to understand as well as possible what would trigger those outcomes. Only with that understanding can we be confident that our policies and goals are aligned. I emphasize once again that we know much more than enough already to be sure that our greatest efforts are needed now to control climate change. As we make those efforts, however, we also need to be continually refining our top-line goals through better understanding of the most harmful potential effects of climate change. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duffy. And finally, Dr. Goldstein, I would welcome your comments.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. Let me start by simply saying that this withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is a public health disaster in the making. It's a mistake of historic proportions. But however well justified, righteous indignation, which we all felt, is compounding that mistake, and we have no time to waste. I am a health scientist. I could bore you, I'm sure, for my 5 minutes with a seemingly erudite description of the many adverse health consequences of global climate change. But while I started in medicine, I'm now in public health. In public health, we develop and translate science, not for the bedside, but for the policymaker and the public. So I'd like to direct you to the public that President Trump appears to be speaking to. We are told of a White House debate between those for and against withdrawing from Paris. Reading President Trump's statements makes it clear that for election purposes, he believes that appealing to those who heavily voted for him is better than appealing to Republicans and independents who do support the Paris Agreement, as has been made very clear. For example, President Trump's withdrawal statement makes much of the allegedly unfair burden to the United States of the agreement. This includes a comment about NATO countries' lax contributions to our critical military alliance. So that's a quote. That's nothing directly to do with global climate change. Mr. Trump appears to be speaking to U.S. military members and U.S. veterans who strongly supported him in the last election. But these are just the people who particularly know the evils of war, and war is always the worst threat to public health. It is abundantly clear that global climate change contributes greatly to the likelihood of war, something already recognized by U.S. military leadership, but not receiving as much attention as it should, nor the needed research effort to better understand and communicate how changes in climate lead to war. Mr. Trump's statement also strongly links European and other countries' unfair trade practices to his rationale for withdrawing. When you look at the election returns, he won by over 60% of voters from rural agricultural areas of the United States. As the EU ambassador will be here, let me point out that the science claimed to justify current EU bans on American agricultural products, which include beef, chickens, and grain. This science is about as strong as the arguments trotted out by the coal industry that global climate change is not caused by humans, which have been so well demolished by my colleagues here. And that's not just not my opinion. That's the opinion of the alleged scientific rationale for these EU trade bans are not even supported by the EU's own Food Safety Authority. We need to show that we understand that American farming practices in many ways are leading to sustainability. We need to support the research that can continue this leadership role. We need to fight against trade barriers that are little more than greed wrapped in a green flag. And we need to better understand the impact of global climate change on American agricultural productivity so that the highly likely adverse consequences are clear to all. A third group aimed at by President Trump are conservative Republicans who, after much trepidation, came out to vote for candidate Trump in far greater numbers than expected. An applause line in Mr. Trump's announcement about the Paris Agreement concerned alleged loss of U.S. sovereignty. My colleague Julianne Hudak and I published a paper less than a year ago demonstrating that concern about environmentalism destroying U.S. constitutional rights, and particularly property rights, has been an increasingly strong part of the Republican platform as you look through the years, and strong part of its rhetoric, although not until recently that of Mr. Trump's. In contrast, one could not find mention of this issue whatsoever in Democratic Party platforms. Isn't it time to emphasize that Democrats are not in favor of distorting U.S. constitutional rights, and to devise a research agenda toward preventing and mitigating the adverse effects of global climate change, in which it is clearly specified that U.S. constitutional protection of property rights will be fully maintained as a basis for this new approach? There's also need to look for common ground with opponents of the Paris Agreement to best achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Preserving and enhancing the U.S. nuclear power industry is one possible approach that's needed. There are others as well. Let me put my physician's hat back on again and say that global climate change has much in common with something many of us in this room, including me, have struggled with for many years, being overweight. There is a forcing function, that of body weight, which, like greenhouse gas, will inevitably lead to discrete impacts, such as the ones so ably mentioned by my colleagues here. The discrete impacts of just continually being overweight, or everything from heart attacks to diabetes and blindness, et cetera. As a young physician seeing patients in the Bellevue Hospital Clinic with adult onset diabetes due to overweight, it was easy to be frustrated and righteously indignant about their failure to heed my directions to lose weight. But righteous indignation does not help people lose weight. What does is understanding the cultural and personal factors responsible for the weight gains. And as with greenhouse gases, any decrease in the rate of weight gain is of preventive value until we can come to grips more firmly with this issue. Similarly, to slow down the consequences of our addiction that is causing global climate change, at least until adults are again in charge, we must ignore the temptation to be righteously indignant and focus on why this has happened and how we can change that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the panelists again, and to say that those of you who may have questions, if you will write your questions on the cards you were provided, a staff person will pick them up if you pass them to the end of the row. Let me start with a question. There seems to be a consensus among the scientific community, and most of us probably here today, that climate change is real and is impacted by human activities. While we may understand this consensus, we also come from different regions of the country that are experiencing climate change in many different ways. How close are we to understanding the regional implications of climate change so that our communities may better prepare us for these impacts? And all of you may comment. You can.
Sure, I'd be happy to address that. The regional impacts of climate change are perhaps more difficult to understand than the global impacts, but we do know a lot. And the regional impacts on the United States have been summarized very nicely in U.S. So-called U.S. climate assessment. And the U.S. climate assessment is something that the U.S. Global Change Research Program is mandated by law to produce every 4 years. The latest was released in May of 2014. The next one is therefore due out next year.
Just wanted to add that while there are larger uncertainties as you probe deeper and look beyond global changes in temperature and in moisture to regional scale changes, there are things that we know with some confidence about those regional scale changes. As we increase atmospheric concentrations of heat-trapping greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels, land tends to warm more than oceans. We tend to get more rainfall at higher latitudes. We will see and are seeing retreat of Arctic sea ice, retreat of snow cover. These are things that have profound regional effects, and the physics, the physical understanding of why these changes are occurring is very good.
If I can add just one more thing I should have mentioned earlier. I spent a good bit of my career as a research scientist working with the state of California, where I lived at the time, to understand the impacts there. And among the impacts in California that are and in the western U.S. generally, that are very well documented and also well attributed to human activities are increases in wildfire activity and increases in water scarcity. And water agencies in California and throughout the western U.S. have understood that for 20 years and have been working very hard to adapt the water delivery systems to meet the reality of a climate with relatively little snow.
Yes.
And if I might add to that, I'm also in California, and just to follow from Phil's remarks, one of the things that's deeply concerning is the change in the timing of runoff from primarily snow-fed river basins. Scientists have observed, with melting of snowpack, a tendency towards earlier runoff by about 2 weeks a year. And that has profound implications for agriculture in California, in the Central Valley. That's deeply, deeply concerning to us. Just finally, climate change, as we're seeing now, is not something remote that is confined to the Arctic or Pacific Islands. In the United States, we are indeed seeing it in our backyards in many aspects of the climate that we experience.
First, I want to thank you for that question. I think it's crucial. I think the so what question has been just central to the fact that we haven't responded as strongly as we should. Now, a little bit of history. When I was in charge of EPA's research and development under President Reagan, and I guess for the young folks here, I should point out he was a Republican. The first money came to EPA. That's 1985, I believe. First money came to EPA for global climate change, global warming, as it was called then. And I lost an internal battle with the Air Office because I wanted to focus on the so what issue. The Air Office wanted to build yet another model, which was already being done so much better by the groups that our colleagues here have talked about. That so what issue is something we must focus on if we're going to really get a change in how people overall respond to this issue. We need to be able to tell people what it means to them individually.
Thank you very much. As many of you know, science is a tool used to carefully test and observe theories that eventually further our understanding of observable events. Can you explain how we have reached this current state of consensus on anthropogenic climate change, and what more can we learn from continually studying the Earth's climate system?
Thank you for that question. I think the thing to say at the outset is human-caused climate change is not a belief system. I'm frequently asked, Dr. Santer, do you believe in climate change? And I respond to people, I believe in facts and testing theories. Fact, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that by burning coal, gas, and oil, we have increased levels of heat-trapping carbon dioxide by over 40% since the Industrial Revolution, from roughly 250, 260 parts per million to now over the historic threshold of 400 parts per million. That's not a belief system. Humans have changed the chemical composition of Earth's atmosphere. And we know a lot about the physics and the physical properties of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. We know the more of them you have in the atmosphere, the more heat you trap closer to Earth's surface, and other things being equal, the planet's gonna warm. Do we observe that warming? Absolutely. We observe it in the oceans, from the surface right to the depths of the oceans, all over the land surface. So there's a very, very clear link between human activities, the increase in carbon dioxide. We measure lighter and heavier isotopes of carbon dioxide and can tell that the lion's share of that increase in CO2 from the Industrial Revolution to the present is on us. It's due to human activities. These are all facts. This is basic science, basic scientific understanding. So in the scientific community, there really is no debate that CO2 is a potent greenhouse gas, that through our activities we have increased its levels in the atmosphere. Through our activities, we have warmed the planet and will continue to warm it unless we, as Dr. Duffy said, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases with urgency and significantly. So all of this is not controversial. Reasonable people can have reasonable debates on the what to do about it, but the science that I've just outlined here is not a belief system.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could add, you know, a question I often get asked is, well, if we know that climate change is real, if we know that humans are causing climate change, if we know that we need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, then why do we still need climate science? And I've even had people ask me, how does it feel for your career to be over and useless? But there's in my mind, there's two very important categories of questions that we need to understand and that we need to use climate science to understand. And one is what I addressed in my opening statement, and that is we don't know as well as we should how much climate change is okay. Is 2 degrees of global warming okay, or is that too much? Is 1.5 degrees okay, or is that too much? And in my opinion, the answer to that question depends on the issues I discussed, the critical warming thresholds that would trigger these catastrophic and irreversible processes. So we need more research to understand, one, how much climate change is okay. The other reason we need more research has to do with the first question you asked, which is about regional impacts. We need to better understand regional impacts so that we can prepare for them, because research has shown that effective adaptation measures can save an enormous amount of money. If we anticipate impacts of climate change, if we design infrastructure and so on accordingly, it will benefit us greatly in the long run.
Thank you. No comment. Yes.
If I might add, the understanding that humans are now an active force of change in the climate system does not, as some have argued, rest solely on computer models of the climate system. We see it pretty much in every piece of observational data we look at, in sea level, in temperature, in the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, in Arctic sea ice extent. And all of these things are independently measured and monitored by different groups around the world using different ground-based or satellite-based instrumentation. And if you're a climate scientist, it's that consistency of the evidence and the sheer volume of the evidence that is so compelling. Again, the evidence does not come solely from models. It's from data, it's from basic theory, it's from understanding of deep time, and it's impermissible to just ignore all of that and focus, as some have done, on one short cherry-picked period of observational record and ignore that overwhelming evidence.
Thank you very much. Dr. Santa, you did mention in your opening remarks that satellite data is often used by climate skeptics attempting to downplay the magnitude of climate change. Why is the satellite data attractive to climate skeptics? And what is your scientific rebuttal to the idea that satellite data disproves climate models that have predicted global warming?
Thank you for that question. At the outset, I'd like to say that I've heard those kind of claims that satellite temperature data disprove, invalidate all of the understanding I just presented to you. I've heard them for years now. I've heard them from Senator Cruz, I've heard them from EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, and I've heard them from many others. We do due diligence. We look at those kind of claims. We see whether they are credible, and they are not. That's the bottom line. Satellite temperature measurements are not a thermometer in space. So the satellites that Senator Cruz and Mr. Pruitt mentioned are NOAA polar orbiting satellites. They've monitored the microwave emissions of oxygen molecules since late 1978. And those microwave emissions depend on the temperature of different layers of the atmosphere. And by having a computer model, you can convert those microwave emissions into an estimate of temperature. But there are a lot of uncertainties that are involved in that conversion process. Satellites drift in their orbit over their lifetimes. The instruments calibrate themselves by looking at cold space and at a hot wire target. And it turns out that that calibration drifts as the instrument is heated by the sun as it's orbiting. All kinds of complex technical issues that you've got to account for, and different groups do that in different ways. There are probably 4 scientific groups in the world now that do this business of trying to back out global scale estimates of temperature change from satellite microwave measurements. And the bottom line is that one group, the group has been prominently featured here in congressional testimony from the University of Alabama, produces estimates of global scale temperature change that are unusually low relative to the other 3 groups. And physically, too, there are aspects of the Alabama temperature data that make no sense, particularly in the tropics. They produce less warming above the tropical ocean surface than at the surface, which violates basic physical understanding. So none of these nuances of the satellite temperature data and what they tell us about the size, the rate, and significance of climate change come out in these hearings, and that's deeply concerning to me. Another pathology, another problem is that folks window in on a short, noisy period of record. So they've typically looked starting from 1997, 1998, so a little over 20 years ago, and marched forward. Well, 1997, early 1998, was the time of one of the largest El Niños in the 20th century. On average, El Niños warmed the surface and the lower atmosphere. So that's classic cherry picking. If you start at a high point and go downhill and say, well, if I look at this artfully selected period of the satellite record, I see little or no warming. That doesn't work anymore, as we showed in our published response to Mr. Pruitt. Even that carefully selected, noisy, short period now shows significant warming over the last 20 years. But more importantly, you can't throw away the evidence. You got to look at the full 38-year record. And if you do, as I mentioned in my remarks, you see warming of roughly 1.25 degrees Fahrenheit, and that warming is highly unusual relative to our best understanding of the natural fluctuations in climate. So bottom line, satellite data, far from being Exhibit A in the case against global warming, are actually Exhibit A in the case for significant global scale warming of Earth's lower atmosphere.
Thank you very much. Let me acknowledge the arrival of our Vice Ranking Member of the committee, Mr. Byer. Thank you for being here. That's okay. We're just happy you're here. You know, as you were speaking, this is my 25th year of traveling from Dallas, Texas to Washington, D.C. almost on a weekly basis. And what I have found is that the past winter, I never really got all of my winter clothes out to wear. And when I first came here, these winters were really pretty bad as compared to North Texas, which is a lot colder than South Texas. So it's clear to me without reading any scientific data that something has changed. And some recently has suggested that the federal scientific agencies should hire a red team of scientists tasked with rebutting mainstream climate science, which they view as tainted by bias. Now, I don't think I'm biased in what I feel, but there seems to still be some question, which I have yet to understand, that the red team, blue team idea is drawn from practices in the national security community, but the science community already has an established red teaming method. It's called peer review, and it has existed for a very long time. So do these proposed red teaming methods add any actual benefit to validating climate change, or do you think this is a political effort to try to derail legitimate science?
Yeah. If I might, I've written something about this together with my colleagues Carrie Emanuel at MIT and Naomi Oreskes at Harvard. This is an issue I care about deeply. Why? Because, in my opinion, it elevates ignorance and tries to give that ignorance the same status as scientific understanding. The bottom line here is we have looked at these issues in incredible detail over the last several decades. Claims that the planet isn't warming, claims that all natural cycles, claims that all warming is due to the sun's energy and some uptick in the energy output from the sun. We would be remiss if we ignored these kind of alternate hypotheses, but we don't ignore them. If you're a climate scientist, that's what you do. You kick the tires, you look at the uncertainties, and we are our own fiercest critics. Some of the folks who have prominently called for red team, blue team approaches have been part of IPCC assessments, National Academy assessments. They've been involved. They've had ample opportunity to advance their critiques of the science, and their critiques have failed. They have not persuaded the rest of the scientific community. But that's not because those critical voices have been ignored. It's because their science has not stood the test. It has been tested and it has failed. So the idea that we would now relitigate well-understood science seems crazy to me.
If I could add a comment to that, and that is, as you said, the red teaming is part of the normal scientific process, and in fact, scientists make their reputations by overturning conventional wisdom. So if that were possible to do, it would have been done within the normal scientific process. I could also add that on the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's webpage, there's a list of 197 scientific societies, not scientists, but scientific societies from around the world, which have affirmed the reality of human causation of climate change. And if that's not consensus, I don't know what is. The other thing I would add is that we understand, I think we all understand that decisions are never made with perfect information. And as Dr. Sanders said in the outset, we will never have perfect understanding of climate change. But when the risks are as serious as they are in the case of climate change, there comes a time when action is due, and action, in fact, is overdue. And we're well past that point on this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Colson.
Let me just follow up on Dr. Duffy's point, very last point. The issue to me is one of looking at a public health approach which says that the criteria for scientific evidence to take action is heavily dependent upon the potential for adverse effects. It would be terrible if I found there was a 10% possibility that this dam was going to burst, and I said, well, it's only 10%. I need better scientific evidence. No, you act on that. in a situation like this, where the evidence of really significant harm of all types, and you've heard it developed here very well, is such that to allow quibbling to go on at this upper end of how much proof do we need is, I think, something that is potentially disastrous for our society, and we really have to stop this argument if we possibly can.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Mr. Byer for questions, and while we also collect the questions from the audience.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. Thank you guys very much for being here. This is so different from our typical science committee meeting that I want to really thank you for putting this together. I had the pleasure of having dinner with Senator Ed Markey last night, who, with the Waxman-Markey was one of the great steps forward, or partial steps forward. And he pointed out that if someone had recently come to him and said, if 97% of the dentist said you needed the tooth to come out, the tooth would come out. If 97% of the people that work for the airline said, don't get on that plane, you wouldn't get on that plane. But if 97% of climate scientists say that climate change is real, we should pay attention. And we recently had a meeting with a senior leader of the Trump administration, who shall go unnamed to protect him, who said that if there's a 1/6 chance or one bullet in a 6-shooter, you wouldn't play Russian roulette with it. It would be crazy. It's just a 1/6 chance that climate change is real and catastrophic. We have to deal with it right now. So, Dr. Duffy, one of the things that Chairman Johnson and I hear again and again at our Science-Based Technology Committee meeting is, if we did everything that Paris asked, everything that Obama asked, we stopped burning any fossil fuels, it would only make a 2-centimeter difference in sea level rise by 2100. And nothing we do really makes any difference. How do we respond to that?
Well, thank you for the question. And before I answer that, I want to just add to your point about Russian roulette by quoting Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney once said, in the context of a terrorist threat, if there's a 1% chance that the threat is real, then we should treat it as a certainty. Well, there's much more than a 1% chance that the threats of climate change are real. I'm sorry, what was your, I already forgot.
We hear, and maybe Ms. Johnson can say it better than I, but that we constantly hear from the climate skeptics. They don't like to be called climate deniers anymore, or climate skeptics, that if we did ban all fossil fuels, it wouldn't make any difference.
Well, look, no, there's no truth to that. And look, one thing that's very important to understand about the Paris Agreement is that the way the agreement works is that it's assumed that commitments that nations make, commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, will be revised continually and will be revised upwards. So folks focus on the initial round of commitments that were made in 2015, and then analyze what the effects of those initial round of commitments would be. And sometimes they analyze them correctly, and sometimes they analyze those effects incorrectly. But then they said, well, there's no point in being part of this process because it's not enough. But that betrays a misunderstanding of the way the full process works. And again, the idea is that every 5 years, each participating country will revise upwards its commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore, over time, the full effect of the agreement will be to bring climate change under control. I will also add that although the assumption is that countries will revise their commitments upwards, it's perfectly legal within the context of the agreement for a country to revise its commitment downwards. And therefore, if folks in the Trump administration feel that the commitments that we have made are somehow unfair or too onerous, it's a very simple matter for them to revise that commitment and revise it downwards, and they can do that unilaterally, and there's no need to withdraw from the agreement. There's no need to withdraw from the UNFCCC process in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, Dr. Santer.
Just want to add to that the issue of leadership. In my opinion, the U.S. has sent a message to the rest of the world by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, and that message is pretty clear. We don't care about this problem, and you shouldn't either. That is a serious, serious mistake. countries that care about this problem, that figure out cheap, effective ways of producing and providing low-carbon energy and reducing emissions of greenhouse gases will be the economic leaders of the 21st century. And the United States has apparently taken the decision, we're going to cede that leadership role to others and let them figure out how to deal with this problem. Again, forget about the climate implications of all of this. Forget about the ethics, the morality, the intergenerational equity. Economically, it makes no sense whatsoever to cede the leadership for figuring out solutions to this problem to other countries.
Thank you very much. Dr. Goldstein, you have this wonderful public health background, and you read the latest Obama administration impacts, and I'm sorry I missed your testimony, but about the growing public health impacts to the United States, from breathing difficulties to heat sensitivity to the growth of the tropical diseases as they move north, et cetera. How do we create a public consciousness of these public health impacts? How do we get people as excited about climate change's impact on our well-being as they were about flu virus or Ebola or Zika or whatever?
We need to be much more, and thank you for that question, we need to be much more forthright about these issues. We need to focus on the so what consequences of global climate changes to me, to my family, to my neighbors. Yeah, and we've heard about these very important modeling activities and other activities that are going on. But again, I would say that we need to have more of a focused research program on so what, and it's got to be regional, just as the climate impact is going to be regional, so is the so what impact is going to be regional on individuals. We heard about the weather yesterday. I drove through it from Pittsburgh here. It's going to be really, you just wonder, sitting in a downpour near Frederick, how those farms that were right near there are going to do well with that amount of rain in that short a time. That's a so what issue that's related to the local farmer. You worry about there are some hills there or there's going to be landslides. These are the kind of things that are much more likely to happen under the what we've heard is going to happen with global climate change. And we need to get that information out in our educational approaches and in our publications as well as we can.
Dr. Santer, I think at maybe the most recent Space Science and Technology or Science-Based Technology Commission hearing when we had 3 climate skeptics and Dr. Mann. It was a most interesting hearing, but the one gentleman who wasn't a climate scientist, maybe a political scientist, you probably remember, but his whole point of being there was to make the case that there was no scientific connection between global warming and extreme weather events. And I think he specifically looked at hurricanes in Florida, which have been on and off. How do you respond to that? And what's the state of the science around drought, wildfires, hurricanes, typhoons, earthquakes, whatever we can tie one to the other?
I believe you're referring to Roger Pilkey Jr.
Exactly. Thank
and
you
I
very
think he
much,
was
sir.
making comments about changes in the frequency of hurricanes. And it is true that the jury is still out in terms of the impact of human-caused warming on changes in the frequency of hurricanes. The jury is not out, however, on the impact of human-caused warming on the intensity of the most severe hurricanes. Our best understanding is that by increasing greenhouse gases, warming ocean surface in critical tropical breeding grounds for hurricanes and typhoons, we're making the most intense hurricanes and typhoons stronger. And that's pretty well understood. Another issue is that by warming and moistening the atmosphere, we are changing, inevitably, the statistics of extreme events. We are changing the frequency, the intensity, the duration of heat waves, of droughts. People have looked at that. There's good scientific understanding of those relationships between changes in average temperature and moisture and changes in in the behavior of these extreme events. And indeed, we can attribute some of the individual extreme events to to our actions. Folks have looked at what they call fractional attributable risk. So how has the risk of some threshold crossing event like the 2003 European summer heat wave changed because of human-caused warming of the planet? So that's the kind of thing we can and routinely do look at, and our best understanding is that we are making such events more likely by warming and moistening the atmosphere. Dr. Goldstein mentioned extreme downpours. Again, good understanding there that as you warm the planet and increase the moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere, you make the most intense storms more severe. More rainfall gets dropped. And we see that, we observe that. So that's concerning, deeply concerning, that in the sort of work that I do, climate fingerprinting, I've spent most of my life looking at these broad brush changes in the temperature of the lower atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, the oceans, but increasingly that sort of fingerprinting work is shifting to the arena of extreme events. Exactly the way Dr. Duffy mentioned, wildfires, floods, droughts, and increasingly scientists are in position to attribute changes in the behavior of those extreme events to human intervention in the climate system.
Dr. Duffy.
If I can add, yeah, I think Dr. Sanders given a very good summary of documented increases in extreme weather activity in the U.S. What I wanted to add is, just as you probably know, sometimes the folks on the skeptical side or on the climate change denier side who discuss this issue sometimes, in my opinion, obscure the issue by looking at financial records, by looking at records of financial losses from extreme weather, and make the point, which is a true point, that looking at those financial records, it's difficult to untangle effects of actual increases in extreme weather from effects of increases in exposure. But it's important to point out very simply that if you want to look for increases in extreme weather, you should be looking in meteorological data rather than in financial data.
Dr. Duffy, as long as you have the microphone, I'd love, your Woods Hole, ocean acidification is something that we've been trying to press the leadership of the Science-Based Technology Committee to focus on. How long will it take? Well, I understand that there's a supersaturation right now of CO2 in the oceans. What's the recovery period?
Great question. I'm afraid I'm not the best person to answer that. I want to point out Woods Hole Research Center is, and Woods Hole Oceanographic are different institutions. Ocean acidification is a serious issue. It's a consequence, as you know, of not of climate change per se, but of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I think it's fair to say that we're still beginning to understand the ramifications of ocean acidification for life in the ocean, the oceanic food chain, and so on.
If I might just briefly add to that, again, the bottom line here is acidification is real. We measure and monitor changes in ocean pH, in ocean acidity at stations around the world. There's evidence in those ocean station measurements of a decrease and acidification of the world's oceans. That's deeply concerning because many critters at the base of the food chain with calcareous shells are sensitive to changes in ocean acidity. And the concern is once you start interfering potentially with their structural integrity, you risk bad things happening. And these changes that we're witnessing and measuring in ocean pH are happening in a blink of the eye on relative to geological timescales.
Madam Chair, you'll back.
Thank you very much. We'll start some of the questions from the audience. The first one, can you speak on the future of adaptation? How do we approach this topic from both a national and subnational level? What methodologies can be used to measure the impacts of our efforts to combat climate change?
Sure, I'd be happy to address that. And this, you know, this gets to, well, refers back to some of the discussion we had earlier, and that is, I think one of the key missions of climate science going forward is to develop better understanding of the specific regional consequences of climate change so that we can develop adaptation mechanisms. And those regional consequences might include extreme weather, might include sea level rise, and so on. And it's important, you know, without that understanding, well, I'll just say we need that understanding in order to make cost-effective investments in adaptation measures. I could also add that I think it's been shown, I'm sure it's been shown, that even without climate change, that we are underprepared for extreme weather, in the sense that even without climate change, additional investments in preparedness would pay off economically. And so, you know, this is one issue where I think we should all agree, and regardless of what part of the political spectrum we fall on, investments in adaptation, and particularly if you believe that climate is changing, even if you're publicly stating that you're not sure about the cause, regardless of cause of climate change, investments in resilience and adaptation are clearly cost-effective.
Yes.
If I might answer the second part of that question, which was how can we tell whether actions that we do really have some impact on the climate system, on things we care about, if we do indeed decide to substantially reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and mitigate. And I point at the example of ozone depletion there. So in the 70s, the world decided depleting stratospheric ozone is a bad idea by human production of chlorofluorocarbons, and the world decided to do something about it. The Montreal Protocol banned certain types of ozone depleting substances, and that was a real success story. And because we have satellite measurements of ozone and of atmospheric temperature, we can now see the telltale signatures of that recovery of stratospheric ozone. Without the ability to continue to observe and monitor the chemistry of our atmosphere, the climate of our atmosphere, we wouldn't know that something we did, the right thing that we did, actually had a good result. And much of this recovery and healing of the ozone layer, that's been beautiful scientific work done by my colleague, Professor Susan Solomon at MIT. So we need continued observations. We need to continue to be able to have scientists working on these issues to determine not only the effects of the things that we're doing now by burning fossil fuels, but also to look at going forward when we make decisions to reduce emissions, when can we see the signals of our decisions in the climate records?
Yes.
Again, a very central question. Briefly, if one thinks about the heat waves, the European heat wave that Dr. Duffy mentioned, if one thinks about Pittsburgh in the summer, an adaptation approach is air conditioning. Air conditioning requires electricity. We are in a vicious cycle very often with our adaptation approaches, and we could spend a lot of time going through all of them. Some of the adaptation that we need is based upon being able to join together and to work together. So there was actually a worse heat wave in Europe a few years afterwards with a negligible, comparatively, increase in deaths. And part of that was just taking care of people and families, being sure that elderly people living by themselves had water, doing things that are, if you will, social capital. So there is a whole series of challenges that we must face. We must understand better, for instance, if we have to do something about exercising down south. Southern states are where our young people have the highest rates of obesity. To what extent is it because it's hot and they don't get out of doors? Multifactorial type of issue. How do we adapt if it's going to be even hotter? Those are the things we need to think about.
Thank you very much. I think this next question from the audience probably you hit on a little bit. Can you speak to climate change impacts on low-income communities in urban or rural areas? Are there any actions that we can take to mitigate the effects on these marginalized communities?
Again, it's a very important question, and a question that has to do with resilience of communities. That is something we're more and more facing, we're more and more trying to work with. A heat wave in Chicago, for instance, the studies that were done afterwards show that the mortality among seemingly similar communities, disadvantaged communities, was related inversely to how much social capital one could see in the communities. How much of a bonding was there? How much of a community group that was supportive of each other one could find in communities, and those communities were more protected. We must, if this is to be yet another part of the cumulative risk that is part of the environmental justice issues we have in this country, we must basically be able to put it in with the other risks and understand how they interact with each other, because none of these stand by themselves. It's not just that there's more pollution. It's not just that, as in Flint, no one is told what happens before it's done to them. The WIMBY, if you will, the why in my backyard, not in my backyard kind of issue. All of these have to be put together and looked at as a group, as we're trying to do now, to which are added these very definite issues related to global climate change.
Thank you very much. Next question. How much of an impact will slashing funding for climate research as proposed in the administration's budget have on continued research into understanding the impacts of climate change?
The president's budget has proposed significant cuts to many federal agencies involved in climate-related research at the EPA, Department of Energy, NOAA, NASA. That's deeply concerning to me as a scientist. We are not going to solve this problem. We're not going to get at the regional impacts and better understanding of those regional impacts. We're not going to get better estimates of the climatic shape of things to come for temperature, for sea level, if we decide that we shouldn't fund this work and that we don't need climate science, we don't need climate scientists, we don't need satellites to observe global scale changes in the Earth's climate system from space. We can't shut our eyes, we can't hold our hands over our ears, and we can't hold our hands in front of our mouths either. This is an existential problem, and I can't tell you how concerning it is to me, having devoted my entire life to trying to understand this problem, to hear now this willful ignorance being expressed at the highest levels of government. I don't believe in trickle-down ignorance, that when ignorance is manifest at the highest levels, when words like hoax, conspiracy are used right at the top, those words matter. Others hear them. So cutting the funding for science is concerning, but cutting the legitimacy for science, undercutting basic scientific understanding is just as concerning. And in my opinion, if you're a climate scientist, at this critical time, you don't have Miranda rights. You don't have the right to remain silent. You've got to tell people in clear English, this is what we've learned, this is what we understand about the climatic shape of things to come, and this is why it matters to you.
If I can add, a number of President Trump's cabinet nominees in their confirmation hearings expressed the view, their own personal view, that while climate change is happening, we're not sure of the cause. Now, as we've discussed here today, the scientific community is very, very sure of the cause. But if one genuinely is unsure about the cause of climate change, then I have to ask, why would one then cut the funding for research that's designed to answer that question? If one is genuinely unsure of the causation of climate change, that argues for, in my mind, urgently argues for an increase in research funding so that we can find out.
Yes.
And just to take that one step further, if you genuinely believe that climate change is occurring, but it's not at all due to human activities, why would you not fund research on the so what question? On the question that you just asked about how is it affecting our communities, how's it affecting our health, how's it affecting our agricultural productivity, all of those others need to be addressed with an increased research budget because frankly, we haven't spent as much on the so what issue as we should have up to now.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Santos.
Again, I just want to underscore this one point. It's critical, in my opinion. We routinely look at it's all natural explanations, all the sun, all natural cycles, all recovery from volcanic eruptions. They don't fit the bill. They don't explain the climate changes we've actually measured and monitored around the world in many, many different climate attributes. So the scientific community has for decades now looked at these explanations that let humanity off the hook. They do not explain what we've seen. So although, as I mentioned in my statement, there will always be some level of irreducible uncertainty in our understanding of this complex system, we know enough, as Dr. Duffy said, that mission control, there's a serious problem, and we ignore the problem of human-caused climate change at our peril.
Yes. Did you? Dr. Duffy, did
I
you?
would just quote Jim Hansen, who said, "We can only pretend that we don't know."
Let me thank each of you, and I have one final question because our time is running out. Can each of you offer your thoughts on what can be done to bring two political parties together on the issue of climate science? Yes, Dr. Santer.
I remember a little while ago during discussion of financial debt, politicians from both parties pounding the lecterns and pointing out the inherent unfairness of burdening future generations with financial debt they did nothing to incur. This debt, this climate debt, the climate changes we're facing and our kids and grandkids are facing, is equally real and is equally concerning. So if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you truly care about equity and intergenerational equity and equity between different segments of the population, you gotta care about this issue. It has to be on your radar screen. You fail the citizens who elected you if you dismiss this issue incorrectly as a hoax, a conspiracy, a contrived, phony mess, quote unquote. You fail in your most basic responsibility. So, irrespective of political party, you need to come together and figure out effective ways of addressing this problem.
My hope is that the political parties could unite around the business opportunities presented by climate change. And it may sound strange, but climate change, it certainly is a threat, but it also does present opportunities. And as we've discussed, as Dr. Santer mentioned earlier today, although we have a lot of the technologies we need to address climate change, there's more that we don't have that we do need. We need better and cheaper technology for energy generation, for energy transmission, for energy storage. We need electric vehicles, and so on. And wouldn't it be nice if our federal government, instead of pretending that there's not a problem, would help U.S. businesses to develop those solutions and sell them to the rest of the world? What an opportunity. And if we don't do that, I think I know which country is going to do that. And wouldn't it be great if that solution could be made in USA?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I said in my direct presentation, I think it's so important to focus on where the support that President Trump sees this misguided action coming from, and to focus on those people and their concerns and their fears about what might happen, and knock out the props by convincing folks who are involved in agriculture that we really do see this as an issue, convince our veterans and our military folks that global climate change inevitably will lead to wars. It's just people will migrate because of these changes, and that will start all sorts of dominoes falling. We need to keep focusing on those, because that's when we do that, then I think you'll find the parties coming together more. And we also need to look for those things that can be done, that both sides can declare victory. I mentioned nuclear power. There are others. A forcing function may be harder to deal with on global climate change is population growth. Are there things that need or could be done together? And you can, I'm sure, find many others. But thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to, this is the completion of the first panel. If you have any closing thoughts, which I think you probably just made, feel free to do that. We'll have about a 5 or 10 minute break before we start with the second panel, of which Mr. Byer will preside. Is that okay? Second panel.
I can't because I have lunch downtown.
Okay.
We'll figure it out.
We'll share it. Okay. You have any final remarks?
Just to reiterate my thanks for the opportunity to speak here this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, it's critically important, particularly at this time. It feels like we're at a crossroads in our country's history, where the decisions that we reach about how to deal with this problem will have far-reaching consequences, long legs. So I'm so profoundly grateful for the opportunity to speak about our best scientific understanding and to push back against this incorrect narrative that nobody really knows the causes of climate change or the likely outcomes if we do nothing. We know a lot about the causes and the outcomes, and the hope is that going forward, folks from both sides of the aisle will be willing to truly listen to that scientific understanding and not dismiss it.
Thank
Let me just add my thanks and for your willingness to fight against what's going to be a tough battle. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you, and we appreciate your taking the time to come. We appreciate the audience being here, and sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. I hope that many of your questions were answered in the presentations. Our second panel will start promptly at 11:30. Thank you again.
Testing 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Testing 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you and now turn to our second panel of the morning for opening remarks, and first begin by thanking the ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Ms. Bernice Johnson, for planning these hearings in the first place. Again, as Ms. Johnson noted at the beginning of the roundtable, we have a number of very distinguished group of experts. Ms. Christiana Figueres is not. Oh, she's okay. She's remote. Hello, how are you? Sorry. Nice. The miracles. Technology Committee. She's an internationally recognized leader on global climate change who served as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for 6 years, including during the Conference of Parties in Paris. And she's joining us remotely from Costa Rica. And then the Honorable David O'Sullivan, the European Union Ambassador to the United States. Ambassador, nice to have you here. And Mr. Jonathan Elkind with Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy and the former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Department of Energy. And finally, Mr. Manish Bapna, the Executive Vice President of the World Resources Institute. So, Ms. Figueres, if you're ready to go from Costa Rica with apparently more snakes than any other country in the world, we would love to have your remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you very much, Ranking Member Johnson, for calling this, and Member Byer for chairing our panel. Yes, indeed, and thank you for the flexibility to join you today via electronic possibility from my homeland, Costa Rica. We may have quite a disproportionate number of biodiversity samples in my country, but we also have the world's leading record on renewable energy, which is quite actually part of the conversation today. So thank you again very much for this opportunity. I would like to focus on context that is very complementary to that of the first panel. I think on the first panel, we heard very, very compelling evidence of the impacts of climate change, both on the natural systems of our planet as well as on human health. And I would like to focus my remarks on where that panel actually just left off, which are the impacts on both the global and the national economies, as I believe that both of these need to be considered as we move forward. I would like to organize my remarks by focusing on three very clear questions. First, what is the purpose of the Paris Agreement? Secondly, what is the logic of the structure of the Paris Agreement? And thirdly, where are we in the process of decarbonizing the global economy? To my first question, what is the purpose of the Paris Agreement? I think we have heard very clearly from our very illustrious scientists this morning that should we proceed with business as usual without our very specific intervention to the contrary, the business as usual would take us to anywhere beyond 4 degrees, 4 or maybe even 5 degrees temperature increase, which actually would lead to such extreme weather events, but also to such depth in the slow onset events that it would make, as the insurance industry has already said quite clearly, it would make the global economy systemically uninsurable. the global economy would be systemically uninsurable. I want us to really understand what that means for the economy of the United States, for the economy of any country, and certainly for the prosperity of humankind, what it would mean to be in a situation where we would be systemically uninsurable. This threshold that we must not cross has actually been called quite compellingly by Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, the jump to distress that must be avoided. So, if you will, I would like to present to you the concept that you can think of the Paris Agreement as a global insurance policy for the stability of the global economy in the 21st century and beyond. Now, it is also very important to understand that for this insurance policy to really help us avoid the worst risks, we must reach what we call the climate turning point by the year 2020. That means by the year 2020, we must be able to have reached the maximum point in our greenhouse gas emissions globally and have already evidence of beginning the descent of emissions. That sounds perhaps like an ominous task, but I have actually two pieces of good news on that one. The first piece of good news on that one is that we're already into year 3, during which the CO2, the carbon dioxide emissions from energy and from the energy industry around the world have actually already been flat, although our global GDP has been increasing at least at 3 or sometimes even 3.5% per year. So we have already started, perhaps, the process of decoupling the global growth of the world from the global CO2 emissions. And it is that decoupling that is at the heart of the Paris Agreement. That is the first piece of good news. The second piece of good news, which is where I would like to focus the rest of my conversation today, is actually the fact that the measures that we put in place to mitigate the effects of climate change not only have the effect of preventing future damages that we have already heard from the science panel, but also they have local and national near-term benefits that we must be able to reap and take advantage of right now. So that is the purpose of the Paris Agreement, is to keep the global economy on track, to keep it growing, and to do so in a clean way. To my second point, what is the logic of the structure of the Paris Agreement? That has actually already been somewhat addressed in the first panel, and I would actually reduce, if you will, the logic of the structure of the Paris Agreement to two fundamental components. The first is that this is a dynamic agreement. It is not static. It does not view the initial round of contributions as the final contribution, but rather it really establishes a process throughout which every 5 years, all countries will come together to see how much they have been able to contribute and then increase their ambition in contributions. And secondly, this is quite contrary to what every other thing that we had under the climate change scheme. We have a bottom-up process that is actually based on national contributions. So before Paris, 189 countries around the world, 189 countries submitted their intended nationally determined contributions. This is important because the logic of the Paris Agreement is actually to be 150% consistent with the national interest of those countries that are participating. In fact, each of those national contributions, the United States not being the only one, but joined by 188 other countries, was actually the result of broad consultation across private and public sectors, and certainly across all productive and industrial sectors of each country. The contributions that are there there because they result in the strengthening of the economy of the relevant country. Now, I would like to just give you a couple of examples of how this is actually already being implemented. Let me start with China. I have just returned from China 1 week ago, and I'm happy to report that I was there for 3 days with blue skies. Why did I have 3 days of blue skies? Because China is closing its coal plants. In fact, there are over 110 coal plants around Beijing, which is the city that I had the pleasure of being in, that have already been closed. Now, are they closing the coal plants because they want to save the planet? No, they're closing the coal plants because that has beneficial health effects on the citizens of Beijing. I would like to give you a couple of data points. In the year 2016, last year, the energy consumption in China increased by 1.4%. And we all know the energy consumption in China will continue to increase as the middle class continues to grow. In the same year, the emissions from coal actually decreased by 4.7%. Yet another evidence that we may, not just globally, but actually already in China itself, we may already be decoupling growth from greenhouse gas emissions and certainly from coal burning. That is, may I emphasize, the third year in a row in which China is growing its GDP, it's growing its energy consumption, and it is decreasing its coal consumption. So very good news on that from China. Another data point that you might be interested in is the fact that China has already become the global leader on green finance by decision of the Central Bank of China. Why? Not because they want to save the planet, but because they know that this is their competitive edge into the future. China is investing $360 billion into renewable energy over the next 3 years because it wants to be competitive in renewable energy and because that investment is going to bring them 13 million new jobs. China is actually already the world's cheapest producer and the largest producer of zero emission vehicles. They will put 5 million vehicles on the roads in China by 2020, and they will construct the world's largest charging network. Why? Because they are concerned about the health of the populations, because they want to create jobs, and because they know that in a society and in an economy that is already irreversibly decarbonizing, they want to be competitive into the future, and they know that the only way to be competitive is no longer on the basis of cheap labor, but rather on the basis of low carbon products and services. So China is definitely investing today in order to be able to benefit tomorrow from a decarbonized economy. India put into the Paris Agreement that they would be 40% renewable energy on their electric matrix by 2030. That is what they promised just 2 years ago. Where are they today? Because solar is today already much cheaper than coal in India as well as in many other countries. They already know that they can be not at 40%, but at 60% renewable energy on their electric grid, and not by 2030, by 2027. So India has actually already upped its ambition with respect to what it put into its national contribution under the Paris Agreement, because of the advancement in technologies, because of the decrease in price, and because, of course, increasing policies in India. Just to look at transportation, India has also already announced that all new vehicles sold in India as of 2030 are actually going to be zero emission vehicles. Why? Because they want to lower their fuel imports. They would like to increase their air quality in Delhi and in many other cities, and because they're very deliberately boosting the auto industry in India. Now, the United States, just to take three of the largest economies, the United States currently already employs more than 250,000 people in the renewable energy industry. That is 10 times more than employment in coal, and 4 times more than the employment in oil and gas. The fact is that today, jobs in solar and wind industry are growing 12 times faster than in the rest of the US economy, beyond oil and gas and coal, beyond just across the board. There is no sector that is growing more in job creation than the solar and wind industries. And as we know from recent polls, 71% of Americans think that we should continue the decarbonization of the economy in the United States because it is good for the economy of the United States, not because they want to save the planet. And that is one of the reasons why over the past few weeks, we have heard more than 1,000 corporations headquartered in the United States saying that they will continue their decarbonization process because it is good for industry, because it is good for profits. We have heard from 13 states. We have heard from about 300 cities and universities, and we will continue to hear very strong commitments to the decarbonization process because it strengthens the economy. To my third point, where are we on this decarbonization of the global economy? Well, I would argue that perhaps the United States is an exception to the rule. But the fact is that the decarbonization of the global economy is no longer in the realm of politics. That was where we were 3, 4, perhaps even 5 years ago. Certainly where we were when we adopted the Paris Agreement. We are no longer there. The fact is that we're now in the realm of market forces. We are now in the realm of much cheaper technologies that are competitive to oil and gas. We're in the realm of creation of jobs. We're in the realm of the competitiveness of the economy into the future. And of course, that those market forces can operate much more effectively, much more strongly if they have a strong public sector signal. But even in the absence of that, those market forces will continue to operate because of the increasing competitiveness of renewable energies. So the fact is that capital is looking for new investment opportunities. The fact is that corporations are increasingly shifting their technologies and their products and their services over to the clean space. And the fact is that in particular, new entrants into the job market, our young people, are constantly demanding more responsible corporations to be their employers. So where are we not doing well? Everything that I have said is actually all good news on climate. Where are we not doing well? I would like to say there are several areas in which we're not doing well, but for the purposes of today, I would like to point out one very specific issue that I think requires and merits urgent attention, and that is what we call the just transition. The fact is that we should be having public programs in the United States and in other coal-producing countries. We should be having public programs for those coal miners that are being increasingly displaced. In the United States, coal miners have been displaced not by the Paris Agreement. They have been displaced because of the fact that natural gas is cheaper than coal and that coal mine owners have actually automatized coal mining, and hence there are no longer the jobs that we used to have. Independently of what the reasons are for the displacement of coal miners, I do not see enough engagement with coal miners. It would be only a matter of moral responsibility and of justice to support these people and to have a public program, whether that is federal or whether that is state-led, for coal miners, certainly in the United States, where they would be able to retrain and be able to participate in an economy that continues to grow, but be able to do that with jobs that do not threaten their health and jobs that have a long-term perspective into the future. I would like to end there my comments, and I'm very happy to answer any questions after my colleagues have spoken. Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to the Honorable David O'Sullivan for his opening comments. Ambassador Sullivan.
Ranking Member Johnson, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your invitation to participate today. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to discuss one of the most significant challenges of our time, climate change. You'll understand what I say when I say that the European Union will accept any invitation to present our views on this issue to any group, and we are also anxious to engage with even people who might not fully share our views if that opportunity were to present itself, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity today, and thank you once again. I'd like to thank Cristina Figueres for her excellent presentation, which has made my role even easier. I'd also like to thank her for her personal commitment on this issue down many years. She's been a very, very important figure in much of the international progress that's been made. Climate change is indeed a very top issue for the European Union and our member states. As the scientific panel showed very clearly earlier today, climate change is real. and we in Europe are steadfast in our determination to combat it, in particular through the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. I'd just like to point out that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is multifaceted with very serious security implications, as has been touched on in the earlier panel. Changes to our climate patterns are causing disruption to our economic activity, as Ms. Figueres pointed out in her presentation, but it also affects human health. It intensifies migration patterns and heightens competition for scarce natural resources. It is also something which will disproportionately affect the poorest countries of the world in the first instance. And we should be aware that these are all critical factors that will contribute to destabilization and conflicts, notably in areas already suffering underlying tensions. And we've seen how it is contributing to the migration crisis in Africa. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier, and we are absolutely clear in Europe that dealing with the reality and the potential impacts of climate change is not an option. It is a necessity for managing global peace and stability in the future, as well as our future prosperity, as has been pointed out by the previous speaker. There are voices, of course, that suggest that climate change is a serious issue, but are concerned with the impact of climate policies on jobs and growth today. We in Europe are of the view that addressing climate change makes full economic sense, and Ms. Figueres has already made some of these points very eloquently. Firstly, the cost of non-action is already huge. The total economic loss from natural disasters such as floods and storms have increased 5 times since the 1980s to around $170 billion today. Second, and perhaps even more importantly, there are many business opportunities arising from the transition to a low-carbon economy. And the evidence showed that there is a net benefit of taking action against climate change, including in terms of economic payoff. We have demonstrated in Europe that reducing greenhouse gas emissions can be achieved while delivering high economic growth. Between 1990 and 2015, the European Union cut emissions by 24%, yet our GDP grew by nearly 50%. And this is not just true in Europe. We're seeing similar trends at the global level. 2016 was the 3rd consecutive year where we saw global carbon emissions stagnate and global economic output grow. A key driver, as was mentioned by Ms. Figueres, is of course, a key driver of this change is China. We estimate that China's emissions have pretty much flattened out in the past 2 years, and breakthroughs in renewable energy technology and a sharp reduction in costs are shaping the way we think about the environment and the economy. The business case for the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy is now evident and is the key to long-term sustainable growth. We believe that climate policies create jobs. Between 2000 and 2013, the European Union increased the number of green jobs from 2.8 million to 4.2 million. We export over 35 billion euros in renewable technology every year. Almost half of the world's wind turbines are built by European companies. So climate change is good for business, if I can put it that way, and it is good for trade, and it is good for jobs. And this is not just the rhetoric of governments, regions, cities, communities, and many of the world's leading companies call for climate action and support the Paris Agreement because it helps us address a very important problem, but also because it helps us move forward economically and socially. The big breakthrough of Paris, of course, is that it is inclusive. For the first time, it brings together developed and developing countries. It divides the burden of action equitably between them to address a problem that threatens us all. It places rights and obligations on all parties tailored to their needs and capacity. Indeed, as Ms. Figueres reminded us, a fundamental element of the agreement is that each country's commitments are voluntary and nationally determined. And yet everyone, 197 countries, have entered into this compact because we believe we have a global problem facing all of our countries. And with Paris, we've entered a new era. The whole world is embracing the clean energy transition, and we believe that this transition is frankly unstoppable. In the European Union, we're very much aware of our obligation to not just discuss combating climate change, but to deliver. We are determined to lead this transition and seize the many opportunities that this leadership represents. We've already proposed key policies needed to deliver our ambitious pledge to reduce Europe's emissions by at least 40% by 2030. We are reforming the European Union emissions trading scheme to ensure the energy sector and energy-intensive industries deliver emission cuts at a faster pace. In other economic sectors, such as transport and buildings, individual targets will be allocated to each member state. The collective objective is to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030 in these sectors compared to 2005 levels. We know that innovation is crucial. We're stepping up our investment in climate-related research and development, dedicating more than 1.1 billion euros per year to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. And we do not lead just by example. We help others to achieve their commitments to embrace a resource-efficient, sustainable future. We are the largest contributors of public climate finance to developing countries. Last year, we provided 17.6 billion euros of climate finance, more than 1/3 of available public funding to tackle climate change. Frankly, Paris could not have been achieved without the commitment and support of the United States to broker a deal. There was enormous American leadership behind that success. But there is still much work that needs to be done to operationalize that Paris Agreement and fulfill its potential. And I emphasize the point made by Ms. Figueres, Paris is a platform. It is a point of departure and a process. We hope that the nationally determined commitments represent a starting point for us all, but the objective of the review process and the peer pressure which will be exerted is to push us to do more and to continue to address this problem in a serious way. So Paris is not the end of the discussion, it is rather the starting point, but it is a new basis for a new international consensus. Clearly, we regret that the United States has decided to take a different path so early in the life of this historic agreement, but we are reassured that the Paris Agreement will live on as the other signatories show unity and resolve in pursuing collective action to ensure the future of our planet. We believe that we're not only on the right side of history, but on the right side of the political and economic and business debate. The US is the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and we cannot escape the fact that the US has a key role to play, and we hope that we can find ways of continuing to cooperate to address such a major challenge. So finally, Ranking Member, I would like to thank the committee for inviting me to explain Europe's views on this issue, and we stand ready to engage with anyone, Democrat or Republican, willing to work with us to ensure that we implement the solutions which we've identified and to work with us on the innovative interventions we will need in the future. Thank you very much, and I stand ready, of course, to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Sullivan. I'll now move directly to Dr. Elkin.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. You have given me an academic promotion. In fact, I'm not a doctor, but I appreciate the thought. The distinguished speakers who have gone before me have addressed the nature of the problem that we face in relation to climate change, the structures that have been put in place, including the Paris Agreement, the risks that stand before us of inaction. I would like to focus in particular on some concrete engagements that have been set in motion in part by leadership from the United States and that stand a good chance, if there is sustained effort, to make a meaningful contribution going forward. In particular, I intend to focus on the importance of international collaborations that the U.S. participates in fully. Collaborations aimed at accelerating the deployment of clean energy in today's marketplace and fostering the innovation that Ambassador O'Sullivan just highlighted and that we need so badly in our energy systems. A core point that I wish to stress in my remarks is that addressing climate change is something that we can and that we should make progress on. It does require commitment and work, but it has huge upsides. So let me pause to stress this point. We need both energy collaborations that focus on deploying clean energy in today's market using today's technologies, and collaborations that emphasize support for innovation that yields tomorrow's clean energy technologies. The focus on deployment now is a vehicle by which to slow the increase in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, thus avoiding the worst consequences of a changing climate. The focus on innovation for tomorrow is one that allows us to improve dramatically the performance of clean energy technologies, reducing costs, a particularly important point, and perhaps producing breakthroughs, whole new technologies, suites of technologies that we may not even see today, but that could emerge into commercial production around 2025 to 2030. This 1-2 punch of deployment and innovation is what we need in order to be able to deliver the deep decarbonization that our scientist colleagues spoke about in the first panel, and also to lift out of energy poverty the more than 1 billion people around the globe who cannot afford and who do not have access to modern energy services today. It's worthwhile to examine the question of whether these are the kinds of engagements that merit the time and focus of our federal government, and whether they in fact merit the taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. My answer is an unambiguous yes. The kinds of collaboration I'm discussing here are all about accelerating the tempo at which deployments and innovation happen. They're about addressing functions that private industry has a huge upside stake in, and I'll talk more about that later. But it's also about addressing segments, particularly on the innovation side, where early stage innovation is not routinely supported across our private sector. Let's be clear that the government funding should not be thought of as a matter of altruism. Projections by every credible source, and they have been referred to by my colleagues already, point out that the clean energy economy that is emerging is one in which there is massive opportunity for job creation, for the birth of new industries, and long-term competitiveness. Now, long-range economic forecasts get to be a little squishy, but just to be indicative about this, the International Energy Agency cites as the scale of the clean energy economy from here to 2040 as one that requires $60 trillion worth of investments. So this is not chump change. Historically, so much innovation has been driven by the U.S. national laboratories, our research universities, and other research institutions in this country. This has been true in regard to shale gas development, no less true in regard to the battery chemistry that we each have in our pockets in our mobile phones, novel wind turbines, and the list goes on. My last point in general on the role of governments is about the link from the strategic to the practical. If it is correct that accelerating deployment of clean energy technologies and innovating to create tomorrow's clean tech is a matter that calls for significant, sustained government investment, then we all need to understand the risks that are posed by the budget that is currently being discussed in this body. If the White House budget proposal were enacted by congressional appropriators, I fear it would represent a dereliction of duty. It would amount to an abandonment of an area that is not only central to the future of our planet, but that is central to the present and future of our economy. 2 weeks ago now, there were a pair of very important meetings that took place in Beijing that relate exactly to this duality, deployment and innovation, and I want to take a minute to highlight them quickly. The Clean Energy Ministerial met for the 8th time in Beijing. Its focus is exactly on the deployment space, and I'd be happy to respond to questions about some of the important outcomes that came from that event. It is important, I think, with Ambassador O'Sullivan seated next to me to acknowledge that not only did China step forward to show the leadership to host this year's meeting of that ministerial, but the European Union and 2 member states have stepped forward to host next year's meeting. This shows that there will be a continued international commitment to that channel of cooperation. Similarly, Mission Innovation, which was announced by President Obama at the Paris Conference of the Parties, had a ministerial level, cabinet level meeting as well in Beijing that focused on the implementation of pledges to double R&D funding from governments and to strengthen links between that early stage research and what is happening in industry where we must see progress as well in order to reach the objectives that we have been speaking about. I regret that the President made the decision that he announced on June 1st regarding the Paris Agreement. I will say that one important piece that the President declared and that Secretary Perry declared as well in Beijing, is their intention to have the United States continue to provide constructive leadership in the climate space, even if outside of the Paris Agreement. This is an important point that I hope that the current administration will hold itself to. Certainly, in order to get there, in my opinion, it is necessary to provide the resources to do that and for the United States constructively to continue engaging through the kinds of channels that I've just spoken about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll move now to Mr. Bebner.
Great. Thank you, and delighted to be here, Congresswoman Johnson, and thank you for organizing this event. President John Adams once said, "Facts are stubborn things." At WRI, we believe in getting facts right. We're committed to rigorous and evidence-based analysis and the importance this should play in informing policy. I strongly support all of what Christiana, David, and Jonathan had said, much there to agree with. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on four points. But I first want to say a word about something that actually took place this morning that I think is actually quite important. A Climate Leadership Council was launched this morning. There was an ad in the Wall Street Journal, op-eds in the Washington Post, in the Financial Times. This council actually comes together with some quite interesting membership. Founding members include big companies like GM, P&G, Exxon, J&J, Johnson & Johnson, Pepsi, senior Republican statespeople, right? James Baker, former Secretary of State to George H.W. Bush, George Shultz, former Secretary of State to Reagan, Mayor Bloomberg, really smart people like Stephen Hawking. And they came forward with this idea about a tax on CO2. And a tax on CO2 where the revenues would be returned to all Americans in the form of a monthly dividend, a carbon dividend proposal. And this is a really big deal. I'll have more to say about the details in a couple of minutes, but the headline here is that the politics on this are changing fast. While a nationwide price on carbon may seem far off in the United States, over 40 countries around the world and 20 subnational jurisdictions are already pricing carbon. And even here in the US, there's quite a bit of support. 2/3 of all Americans and more than half Republicans support a carbon tax. We're increasingly confident that what may seem inconceivable in the US will soon seem inevitable. And this was the theme of the op-ed in the Post by George Shultz and Larry Summers. Common sense can win out even here in Washington. Now let me just come briefly to my 4 points. The first one has to do with China and India. You heard from many of my colleagues that Trump is mistaken. Both of these countries are doing a lot on climate. Christiana was in Beijing last week. I just got back from Delhi. Blue skies. It was 108 degrees, right? There's a lot of sun in India. And about a few years ago, President Modi made this very ambitious target of 100 gigawatts of solar, right, by 2022. At that time, India had less than 3 gigawatts of solar installed. So in 7 short years to go from less than 3 to 100. And just to put that in perspective, the US today only has 45 gigawatts of installed solar. So it's a bold, bold target, possibly one of the biggest out there. And this is in a country that has per capita income that is 5% what it is here, right? So really, and earlier this year, the government indicated that they're not going to build any more new coal-fired power plants until 2027. And by that time, renewables will be quite a bit cheaper than coal. So the story is changing incredibly fast in India, in China, and they're acting on climate because it makes, as you heard, good economic sense. There's energy security reasons, there's important air pollution reasons, and there also is, quite importantly, a moral desire to do something on climate. But all those reasons give us much more confidence that those commitments will be sustained. The second point I want to make is that here in the US, businesses, states, and cities are stepping up. The irony of President Trump's decision on Paris is that we're seeing a much greater outpouring of support for the climate agreement in the U.S. than ever before. More than 2,000 businesses, states, and cities have pledged their continued commitment to the agreement through this We Are Still In coalition. Over 1,500 companies, 300 U.S. cities, including, I think, the mayor of Dallas, which is, I think, where you are from, and also, the mayors of Houston and Austin, which I think your counterpart, Chairman Smith, also has partially covers. 22 states. So there is this great kind of outpouring, but we need to recognize that while subnationals are stepping up, it won't be enough without federal action, right? We can get to the commitments, close to the commitments perhaps, that the U.S. made by 2025, but it'll be very difficult to get the rapid decarbonization we need to see after in the absence of federal policy, and it will be quite a bit more expensive. The third point I want to make is about the economics. And as you've heard from my colleagues, the benefits of climate action increasingly outweigh the costs. One of the most frustrating aspects of this administration's U-turn on climate is that it rests on a deep misunderstanding of the evidence. Trump continues to perpetuate the old-fashioned view that one has to choose between economic growth and climate action. But that's a false choice. His approach is like trying to bring back the horse and buggy when we know electric vehicles are the future. Trump said that the Paris Agreement would cost $3 trillion and 6.5 million jobs by 2040. This is a completely flawed analysis that assumes a very unrealistic and unnecessarily expensive pathway to achieve the U.S. emissions targets. It also reflects an incredibly low view of American creativity and ingenuity. No gains from technology, a very dismal view of the U.S. private sector. And on the contrary, I think many of us think businesses, investors, entrepreneurs will respond. Smart climate policy can lead to more technology, more jobs, more growth, for three basic reasons. The first is efficiency. Smart climate policy can lead to much greater resource efficiency. Think about light bulbs. Residential LEDs, they 75% less energy, last 25 times longer than incandescent lights, right? Good for the bottom line, good for planet. The second reason smart policy is good for growth is because it can stimulate innovation. Think about the dramatic decline in solar prices we have seen in the past few years. Who would have thought that the coal mining museum in Kentucky, the owners would say, we're going to shift from fossils to solar because solar is cheaper and we need to save money. And third, smart climate policy can give much greater predictability. Businesses are looking for a clear, unequivocal market signal. That's why so many businesses are adamant about backing Paris. By refusing to act on climate, what Trump has actually done is created uncertainty for business. And this is going to delay investment, it's going to delay job growth. And neither Trump nor we want to see that. And that brings me to my last point, which is I think we do need clear policy signals from Congress to ensure that the low-carbon path is efficient and dynamic. The Climate Leadership Council proposal that came out this morning proposes a $40 carbon tax, and that rises over time. Implementing this proposal would reduce emissions much deeper, much faster than the current trajectory that we have in place. A carbon price, complementary regulatory policy is often the cheapest and most efficient way to reduce emissions. So to conclude, despite President Trump's announcement, we're not backing down. We hope you won't either. Climate change is undeniable. A low-carbon, resilient future is inevitable. The only question is whether we will get there fast enough and whether the U.S. decides to lead or follow. We look to you for your leadership to make sure the U.S. isn't stuck in the 20th century with a high-carbon, low-efficient economy, but instead looks to the future for the 21st century economy that is both low-carbon and highly efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll collect the questions as we begin the questioning period. First, now I want to go to Ms. Figueres. Can you hear us okay?
I can indeed.
Can you share with us your perspective on the agreement, its importance to the world, and whether it can still be an effective framework to follow up in addressing climate change from Paris?
Indeed. Thank you very much, Ranking Member Johnson. Yes, indeed. The Paris Agreement, as has been discussed here by my colleagues, this Paris Agreement is alive and well. It is not going to be stopped. The fact is that it is a very powerful macro structure for the transition of the global economy that has been designed from the bottom up by all the participating countries. And because it is based on the national interest of all participating countries, A, B, because it has the wisdom to acknowledge that this is going to be a process of perhaps several decades of increasing capacity in the technologies, of increasing shift in finance, and of increasing reach in both national and subnational policies. The Paris Agreement is wise enough to understand that we have a starting point, which is the national contributions, but that this will occur actually every 5 years in incremental increases of ambition. And as I have already pointed out, India has actually already just 2 short years after putting their contribution, they already know that they can do much better. I suspect that China also knows, but they will not be public until they have certainty. And I would say you can make the same argument about other countries. So yes, the Paris Agreement remains a very, very effective structure that will guide and support national and economies, and in the cases in which that is not possible at the national level, certainly subnational efforts, as we have heard, toward the decarbonizing of the global economy and toward strengthening the economies of those that participate.
Thank you. Ambassador O'Sullivan, in the aftermath of the U.S. federal government's decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement, there's been some concern that other nations might follow. Has the exit of the United States changed the strategies or the goals of the EU in this fulfillment of the agreement?
Thank you for the question. No, not in the slightest. We remain absolutely firmly committed to this agreement for all the reasons that Cristina Figueres just outlined. This is the first time where we have succeeded in bringing literally the entire planet together around this common problem. That is the great achievement of Paris. In the past, there has been a developed versus developing world divide, a sense of the developing world that the developed world was responsible for the problem. And now, just as we were identifying it, we were asking them to pursue a different path, which might have been to their economic detriment. We have the great breakthrough of Paris is that we've got everyone coalesced around the problem with a common framework for addressing it, but as Ms. Figueres pointed out, a national pathway, or in our case, a European pathway to addressing it, which takes into account the specificities of each country, where they are at any given point in time, and their national ambitions. And we are absolutely committed to taking this agreement forward. As I said earlier, it is a framework. There's still a lot of work to be done. By the way, there's a big issue of transparency. The Transparency Working Group is co-chaired by the United States. This is a very important issue because I think it's very important that we follow closely what each of the countries is actually doing to implement their commitments. There's other work to be done in implementing Paris, and the European Union will be firmly engaged in making that happen and in continuing to make this a living vehicle for addressing this global problem at a planetary level with the widest possible international cooperation.
Well, thank you. I guess this can be responded to by all. As rapidly developing countries like China and India are often viewed with skepticism when it comes to following through on emissions reduction targets. Is this skepticism misplaced, and what has China or India has done since signing the Paris Agreement to indicate their commitment to following through, and how does the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement impact the role of either of those countries?
Could I jump in because I believe I presented you with some very hard-nosed data there on both China and India, and I guess I was almost guessing that that question might come up, and I wanted to provide that data. What is very interesting to note is, as the ambassador has already noted, that the European Union is definitely not backing out, and that in fact, even 24 hours before the announcement in the Rose Garden, the European Union joined China, even before the announcement, as I say, in coming out and saying, whatever the United States decides, both the European Union and China will continue to go ahead for their own national interest. And then after the Rose Garden announcement, may I say that at least 125 countries have actually come forward to say that they will continue within the Paris Agreement, that they will continue their decarbonization process. So, and they're doing it, as I have said, and as we have all agreed already this morning, because of their national interests and the strength that they see in the future of their decarbonized economy. As the ambassador has pointed out, it is going to be very important to have full transparency and integrity in this decarbonization process. And therefore, it is important to rely not only on announcements, but rather in proof, on quantification. There are very, very important concepts already and principles of transparency, measuring, reporting, and verification that have been agreed as an integral part of the Paris Agreement. But the details of how that is going to be done is actually the homework of federal governments from now until 2020. That is why it is important to have constructive participation of all governments over the next 3 years to be able to iron out the rules of engagements and the rules of reporting, monitoring, and verification so that we can have full transparency. Having said that, there is no information whatsoever that we should be skeptical or even question the efforts of all countries currently engaged.
Thank you very much. Now, what we have seen in view of this pullout is that many of the companies in this country pride themselves with committing to hitting the CO2 reduction targets with or without the support of the federal government. And this is very encouraging, especially since the polls indicate that 71% of the Americans with majorities across party lines think that the country should remain in the Paris Agreement. So let me just pose this question to Mr. Elkin and Mr. Babner. We received a question on social media regarding ways in which Congress can cooperate with local government officials, like my mayor of Dallas, Mr. Mike Rollins, who has agreed to uphold the Paris Agreement targets. And what is appropriate for the role of Congress, do you see? I'd like you to comment on. And in the absence of strong action by Congress, what can be done on the city, state, and even corporate level to signal America's commitment to climate leadership? Yes.
Thank you for that question. I think that there are a lot of opportunities where congressional action can help to sustain the kind of commitment that you've talked about from the business community and from state and local governments. In particular, this would go in part to making sure that the companies that can participate in this global marketplace are not only those that are most international, largest scale, and already very actively participating in markets around the globe. In my time at the Department of Energy, I participated, for example, in a trade mission that DOE jointly conducted with the Department of Commerce. We took about 30 clean tech companies to 3 different cities in China. This kind of engagement by those departments, also by our U.S. Trade and Development Administration, and by EXIM and OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, are vital. And I want to stress in particular, Madam Johnson, that it is important that the activities of that sort also be focusing on small and medium enterprises that wouldn't otherwise have the capability to go out into that global marketplace. they are where some of the most innovative new technologies are growing, so it's important to sustain them. In regard to cities, one of the pieces that I've already heard from municipal leaders that has been cut as a part, or is proposed to be cut as part of the administration's budget, are those programs that support capacity building and sustaining capacity in the cities so that they can do climate-sensitive strategy and planning. This is another area that I would focus on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Babner.
Great, thank you. On businesses, I think that this proposal around a climate leadership council, this idea of a carbon tax, really deserves a strong hearing, a real deliberation around the merits around the proposal, the details around the proposal, and I think if Congress could actually bring together CEOs of businesses that have endorsed this proposal, bring in some of the Republicans, you could really create a very vibrant, serious conversation about long-term, clear market signals for a low-carbon future. That is what gets businesses excited. And, you know, it may not seem that right now is the perfect moment for it, but I would argue it'll happen much more quickly than what we realize in terms of the opportunity to move forward with something that is serious about carbon pricing in this political climate because of the much more efficient, more effective role that such a policy can actually play. So I think just creating a number of conversations around the idea of this proposal would do a lot to move the agenda forward. I just want to say one other small point, just in response to the question around China and India. I just want to say that the reason why there should be a lot of confidence in what they're doing is that both countries are looking for a good growth story. We all know that China struggling a little bit to sustain 8-9% growth. They know that their growth model from the past 30 years cannot be the growth model for the next 30 years, right? They need to move from heavy manufacturing, from investment, to greater reliance on consumption, greater reliance on services, greater reliance on innovation. And in part, their commitment to this low-carbon future is a recognition that that actually represents a much more attractive growth story for China's future than what the past model did. And India is seeing that. India is going through the same, they're driving down the costs of clean energy at a way that is quite remarkable, at a pace that is much faster than what we expected. And so I think the question about why should we believe that these countries will do what they say that they are doing? We absolutely need the transparency provisions that the ambassador and others have mentioned, but we also need to recognize that this is increasingly, bluntly, in their economic self-interest. It is in their security self-interest. It is in their public health self-interest. Air pollution, Delhi is the most polluted city in the world, right? We heard in the previous panel the importance about the so what, the public health implications. This is why I think we should have a lot more confidence in the pace and in the ambition that these countries have to take action on climate.
Thank you very much. We'll now start to read the questions from the audience. Based on statements by the President and other administration officials, what do you see as potential paths moving forward or ways for international engagement past Paris withdrawal, and is the global community open to the U.S.'s engagement? And all of you may comment.
Sorry, I would like to jump in, but let me see if I understood. The question is the rest of the world still open to U.S. engagement despite the announcement? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, yes, most definitely. Most definitely, there is, as we have heard, first of all, from other federal governments, starting with the European Union, certainly, but not limited to, but rather going way, way beyond, from great economies to small economies. There is an openness for U.S. engagement, and I think what is beginning to become evident outside the United States, that there is a lamentable difference between the US federal government opinion and the US real economy. And the other sectors around the world are very interested in engaging with the US real economy, and hopefully also with support that that US real economy would receive from subnational and hopefully from U.S. Congressional support as well. So yes, there is an expectation and a wish that the United States would continue to lead and or would continue to participate, and at some point when that may be appropriate, that the United States federal government would again enter into an international, intergovernmental leadership position that I think everyone laments. But that is not going to hold anyone back. And if I could just move one step to your previous question, Madam, the fact is that to question the transparency of engagement, or question whether any country, India, China, or anyone else, to question their engagement with climate change assumes that their engagement is perceived as a burden. I think if there is any clear message that should come out of this very important hearing that you have called, is that climate change is not perceived as a burden by any country. It is perceived as an opportunity. It is perceived as an opportunity for improving health, for strengthening the economy, for energy independence, for job creation, for so many of the very, very positive advantages that come from it. So because of that, because it is an opportunity, all countries will continue to move forward, and all countries will remain open to the participation of the United States, independently of the level of government at which that participation will occur.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Just a small point to build on this question about engagement with the U.S. I'm involved in two what are called Track 2 dialogues between former government officials, experts, policymakers from two countries that come together to talk about how to improve and strengthen relations between the two countries through official channels. So there's a dialogue that we are part of both with U.S. and China and U.S. and India, and both U.S. delegations are bipartisan, involve people from government, from the private sector, and so forth. The day after Trump made the announcement of the U.S. withdrawal, the Chinese delegation called us up and said, we immediately want to talk to you about what this means and how we continue to engage with the United States. The same conversation is happening with India. And what people, I think, are increasingly recognizing is that the federal government doesn't speak for the country, and that there is significant opportunity for engagement, for dialogue with states. You take Governor Jerry Brown, who was in Beijing last couple of weeks ago for the Clean Energy Ministerial, with cities, with the private sector, that there are still very thoughtful, very important voices in the American economy that want to take climate action, and that these other countries see a real opportunity to engage in constructive ways with them.
Yes.
If I might jump in there, I would highlight the following. One hopes that one of the things that can unify the U.S. political system, even in a very difficult period in our history, is the idea of investing in the future. And that takes me directly to the idea of joint support from both sides of the aisle in the Congress for budgets that support clean energy innovation. Today, there is a major new report that has been released by the Bipartisan Policy Council. They have created there an industry-led American Energy Innovation Council, which today is put out on the street, a major new report focusing both on the need for clean energy innovation sustained over time, and the opportunities that represents for not just the climate, but also for the kinds of issues that I was remarking on in my presentation: job creation, economic competitiveness over the long term. So one of the pathways that I think is very important, that I hope that the Congress will focus on as a part of the appropriations process, is to sustain and, if possible, increase budgets for clean energy innovation that sit at a number of different agencies, including my former agency, the Department of Energy. It's a matter that goes to the future for all of those communities where the institutions sit, but also for our economy as a whole.
Yes, Ms. Smith.
Well, just to be clear, it would be preferable if the United States was not leaving the Paris Agreement. I mean, this is, we should not minimize the importance of this decision. And I just take the opportunity to remind colleagues that, the U.S. is the second largest emitter in the world. And if you look at the carbon intensity of your emissions, you are way by far the most important polluter with a carbon intensity of 16 tons. And you're one of the three largest economies in the world, along with the European Union and China. So, if the U.S. were to disengage from this process, the impact on the rest of us would be considerable. It's not just a decision for the United States. It will impact on the global economy and on global emissions. So we all have a stake in this. So we would very much have wished that the United States remain in the agreement for all the reasons that have been mentioned. Now, we are where we are, and we have to acknowledge that. And therefore, we would very much hope, as everyone has said, that we find other ways that the U.S. will continue to address this problem and will continue on a path of reducing these emissions. And we are willing to engage in whatever way is possible to ensure that the United States continues to make the important contribution which it must to this process, without which the efforts of the rest of us will be somewhat undermined. So I notice that in the United States sometimes the discourse is rather that the United States is doing things and others are benefiting from it. Well, frankly, you can flip that the other way and present this as very worrying for the rest of the world, that an economy as large as the United States and with the emissions that you have would not take this choice. Now, the other point, I think, is, which we all agree very strongly, I think the business case for the transition is frankly at this point irreversible. And I think industry is committed. And I think for market reasons, they're going to go in that direction. So in that sense, I'm relatively confident, and particularly in this great country with the innovation and the intelligence and the entrepreneurship, that America will, in spite of everything else, continue to be a leader in this regard. And also it's very encouraging what is happening at state and at city level, and cities will certainly be important drivers of this process globally, also in Europe and in China and elsewhere. So I think we will try to welcome continued American engagement, and I think it is important, and not just for political reasons, but for the very evident emissions numbers that I've just quoted.
Thank you very much. I think you just answered this question, but I'll put it before us anyway. Is there a concern that too much focus on state and corporate climate action to fill the vacuum of the U.S. Paris withdrawal will erode or obfuscate the crucial role of federal and national policies needed to make significant emission cuts? It's especially asking Ambassador O'Sullivan. I think you just probably commented on that.
Well, I hope it's been clear from everything that's been said. Paris is not a theoretical construct. It's not a political. I mean, there's politics behind us, but it's a very practical way of assembling a coalition of 197 countries on this planet to help us find a collective way forward in an equitable and balanced way, respecting the specific situations of each country. But the bottom line here, as we have all been saying, is that we actually have a major common problem, and it is in our economic, health, and security interests to address that. And Paris is the vehicle for doing that. Now, frankly, if Paris didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. So, in my view, this is not a theoretical debate. It's an intensely practical debate.
Yes.
Great. If I could fully agree with what the ambassador said, but if I could just build a little bit on that, because it is a really important question right now. And just to put some numbers kind of on the table just for one moment, as we all know, the U.S. target was to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% in the year 2025, 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in the year 2025. Currently, as of a few months ago, greenhouse gas emissions in the US were about 12 to 13% below 2005 levels. If you roll back, if we assume that everything that President Trump says he will do actually happens, and that is a debatable proposition, things will be held up in court, Congress has an important voice to say, rulemaking processes are complex, but even if you take that everything that he says he would like to rescind actually happens, a number of groups, but I'm going to call out Rhodium Consulting as the analysis I'm just picking the numbers from, says that even with that, you would get somewhere between 15 to 19% below 2005 levels, kind of where emissions would be, which would be a far cry from the 26 to 28% that the US target was. And here comes the point. Can businesses, cities, and states, if they do more than what was already anticipated, make up that difference? And I think the answer is perhaps in part, but it'll be exceedingly difficult to get all the way there. And it'll be extremely difficult to get beyond 2025, where we need to get to in 2030, 2040, 2050, and it'll be much more expensive. So the premise of that question about the importance of having a clear, efficient policy at the federal level is a really important one that I think the ambassador and the person who asked the question rightfully posed.
Another question. Could you draw a clear line for those of us where it isn't so obvious? We know that climate change will most likely impact poor nations first and more severely than the U.S. Why should that matter to us, and why should we care? How do we answer that question? Yes.
This is one of the most important questions, I think, that can be put in front of us, in front of the Congress, in front of the American public. And this question has been posed and answered numerous times by our national security establishment, including both the Pentagon and the intelligence community. The point that is made time and time again, and the ambassador used the phrase, is that climate change is a threat multiplier. So whatever other pre-existing stresses exist in a society, multi-ethnicity, poor, low levels of economic development, possibility of exposure to severe weather events, whatever those pre-existing risks are in the first instance, the story only gets worse as hydrological patterns are disrupted over time and agriculture suffers. People lose their livelihoods. They have to find a way to get to some place where they can provide for their families. So I would encourage us all to review the assessments that have been put out by the National Intelligence Council, by the Central Intelligence Agency, by our Pentagon, for now more than 15 years. They have been doing this kind of work. It is a deeply sobering bit of reading. It should not leave any of us feeling comfortable.
If I could just jump in there with just to emphasize that point, we are currently at global levels. We have 60 million displaced people around the world, which is the highest level of displacement that we have ever had. Those 60 million could easily be duplicated or triplicated by climate impacts. That kind of displacement would be a national threat to most countries around the world. We absolutely cannot move into a situation in which we will have that kind of pressure on all borders, let alone that kind of pressure for the survival of people who would rather stay in their own homes, would rather stay where they were born and where their grandparents have their bones in the ground. They would rather stay there. They are not going to move because because they want to. They're moving out of desperation. They're moving out of survival. We cannot move into a world that forces involuntary migration at levels that are exponential to the displacement levels that we have now. That is a major national threat that has been recognized by the US security and intelligence community, as well as by the Europeans and by many other security and intelligence forces around the world.
No, just to, I mean, I think the three main threats are firstly migration, as has been mentioned, and I think this is a very serious issue. Climate change, migration could become one of the most important sources of new migration impetus, and this is something from which we are not insulated, neither the United States nor Europe. Regional conflicts over scarce resources, and these regional conflicts can then spill over with other implications, because what starts in one region can begin to involve other people. And once again, I don't believe that the United States or the European Union would be able to insulate themselves from those consequences. And finally, you will probably have failed states and countries literally imploding in ways which we know what happens. We have other examples of what has happened when countries fail to function and fail to deliver for their citizens. So these are very serious risks, and I agree entirely with Jonathan that there's excellent work done by the U.S. security analysis, which is very sobering to read. And these are very clear that we cannot isolate ourselves from these threats. They will not simply be things that happen to developing countries far away and we'll watch it on our TVs. Very quickly, it'll be on our doorstep, and it will have immediate consequences for our security, for our prosperity, and for, frankly, our way of life.
About 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln once said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. There is a profoundly important moral question about this as well. Most of the people that will be most deeply affected are those that had contributed the least to this problem. And I think this country has shown time and time again an ability to rise up and demonstrate that moral leadership in the world. And so I fully agree with all the arguments that have been made as to why it would be in our self-interest. But I also think that it's incredibly important for us to also, demonstrate once again that moral leadership that we should have to make sure that those who did not contribute to the problem don't suffer in such existential ways.
Oh, sorry. One final question. How does the structure and progress made in the Paris negotiations open new doors for another global agreement, if at all? And is such another agreement necessary after the petitions of the U.S. changed after the politics of the U.S. changed with another administration?
Well, I would like to jump in there with very, very unequivocal answer. No, there is no space for another agreement. I think all countries have very, very clearly indicated that this is a multilateral agreement, that there is no such thing as a unilateral decision to cancel a multilateral agreement. This is a process that has been constructed bottom up by all countries to accompany the decarbonization process over the next few decades. There is no such thing as renegotiating the agreement. There is no need to have another agreement. We would probably have to use something else if the agreement had been constructed as a static structure. But as we have all been emphasizing, the Paris Agreement is actually dynamic in nature and foresees that there will be improvements over time as technology, policy, and finance shift. There will be improvements, and hence all countries will be able to contribute more as time goes by. So no, there is no renegotiating the Paris Agreement. No, there is no other agreement that is foreseen, and everyone stays on course.
Obviously, I agree 100%. I mean, we shouldn't over-engineer over-engineer this. The Paris Agreement is 29 articles, which are largely procedural. They set out a, excuse me, a framework in which we agree to international cooperation and how we take this forward. The core of it is then the national determined contribution or commitments, which are what each country has said they will do in order to, on the substance of this issue. Frankly, I don't know what another agreement could do than that. That's why I said if Paris didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. And Paris existing, I don't think you need to reinvent it, or I don't think trying to engineer it differently is going to give you a different outcome. This is what the international community, and let us not forget, there's 197 countries, only 2 countries until now not participating, and now perhaps a third with the United States. But this is a remarkably simple and straightforward agreement which simply sets out the procedural steps, and as Christina said, it's not a static agreement. It precisely contains all the elements of its future adaptation, and we can take account of changing science, of changing technology, of changing economics situations. It's a very flexible agreement from that point of view. Hopefully, it's going to be flexible in the direction of doing even more than we have initially committed to as we go forward and as the momentum builds behind this decarbonization of the global economy. But it is a very simple, straightforward, even if it was difficult to negotiate, I don't want to underestimate the challenge for those who had to do that, but it is relatively straightforward, and frankly, we couldn't even see why you'd want to begin to think of there being some other agreement. This is what we have, this is what we've agreed, this is what we're going to take forward.
Thank you. Do we have further comment? As a closing question, how would you respond to those who claim that breakthrough energy solutions are not viable to address near-term climate impacts and are too costly for consumers in the short term? Yes.
So I think that there are some important threads that come through in that question. One is the distinction between deployment of technologies that exist in the marketplace now and why, to what end, one engages in focused efforts in regard to innovation, to creation of tomorrow's energy technologies. There are lots of tools that we have available today, most particularly avoidance of energy demand, energy efficiency efforts, that can make the problem we face easier the faster that we take action now. In the innovation space, it's not just a question of coming up with the new whiz-bang technology that's going to allow us to do things we never thought that we could do, but it's also about pushing down costs progressively. Manish referred to some of the cost reductions that have happened in regard to solar. You can also look at light-emitting diodes, LED lamps, battery technologies, et cetera. And the extent of the cost reductions in the last decade has been breathtaking, and we need to do that in a whole range of other technologies going forward. So we should not confuse the need for new technologies that get us to deep decarbonization by mid-century. We should not confuse that with the ability to act now based on technologies that can be deployed in the market today.
Any other comment? Yes.
I mean, just a small point to build on that. One of the very important initiatives that Jonathan and his colleagues at DOE led in the previous administration were these, what he mentioned earlier, kind of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition and Mission Innovation, 2 coalitions which were about stimulating more R&D and more private capital into breakthrough technologies for that next generation of technologies. The point he made is absolutely right, which is that where we need to go for the next 10, 15 years, those technologies exist on the market today. Those cost curves for solar, for wind, are coming down in dramatic fashion, battery storage. But it is true that where we need to be in 2050 at net zero emissions in this country, hugely important to get some other technologies, such as carbon capture and sequestration, up on board at a scale that is much greater than where we are today. And that's where a price on carbon, real investment in R&D can play a huge role. And it's a timely question because I believe it was today in 1979 that Jimmy Carter installed his solar water heater on the roof of the White House. So this country does have some experience with innovation and breakthrough technologies.
Maybe this is a little bit far away, but do you have any ideas of how not doing anything becomes too costly? When we consider what could happen with health care, with health conditions, what is your idea of it being too costly to do this, to make these changes? Yes.
It depends on how one is framing the idea of cost. There is a cost that is implied, and I emphasize that in my remarks, that we need to provide funding in order to sustain the innovation engine that has been the U.S. economy. Only by investing now do we reap the benefits in the future. But this is, as has been stressed, a matter of our self-interest. It is about job creation. It is about long-term competitiveness. It is also about what we leave to our children and their children. So in my opinion, these are the kinds of things that we need to be finding the way to support. And I certainly hope that the Congress will do that. And I want to stress, maybe this might be my last intervention, how much I appreciate, Ranking Member Johnson, your leadership here. I hope there might come a time when your counterparts on the other side of the aisle might join this kind of a discussion, because I think it's been very important, and I think it's far-sighted. It's where this committee's efforts should be focused. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you. If you, just for a final comment, if you have any suggestions of how you can encourage us to come together on both sides of the aisle and maybe lead toward a consensus. If you have any thoughts you might want to share, we would appreciate that.
Well, if I could venture in there, and this may be my also last intervention. So let me thank you also, Ranking Member Johnson, for this initiative. I think we all look forward to bipartisan congressional leadership, both for the benefit of the United States as well as for the benefit of the world. And I think we have to recognize that it is not very often that you have a full alignment between national opportunity and global need. And because that full alignment is there, and because of the risks of doing the opposite are so high, we must really take advantage of that alignment. And how to do so, I think, has been discussed here today. Perhaps we leave climate change, the discussion on the climate change on the environmental side of this to the side, and we focus on the real impacts, the real opportunities that are here, from job creation to energy security, to better health, to modern transportation, all of the benefits that can be had by acting on climate change, or rather by decarbonizing the economy, whichever way you seek to look at it. But I think the announcement that has come today out of the Leadership Council is already a very good evidence of bipartisan interest in the strength of the economy of the United States. And I think if we focus on that, and we leave what apparently is pretty contentious about the CC world, the climate change world, well, let's focus on the very, very important short-term benefits that can be had for the US economy to actually engage alongside the other economies of the world in this, frankly, very exciting transition that we're undergoing. I think we have to, look forward to a world that will be completely transformed by the kind of energy and transportation and land use and buildings that we're going to have. It's actually a very exciting future that we're peeping into. And so if we can share that excitement and contribute to bringing the future into the present, because that's what we need to do. If there's anything that we need to do is actually to accelerate the pace with which we're going into. And because it's an exciting future, because it has benefits for all, it can and should be a bipartisan effort.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Two very specific things, items where I think we can potentially find some bilateral support in Congress. The first, which we haven't really spoken much about today, but is quite important, is the issue of climate finance. President Trump, in his announcement, spoke about negating future contributions that the United States would make to a fund called the Green Climate Fund. This Green Climate Fund was set up as part of the UNFCCC process as a way to channel money to some countries who would need that support in order to mitigate and adapt to climate impacts. The United States made a $3 billion pledge. Only $1 billion has gone to the fund. I believe that $2 billion represents, less than 0.4 of 1% of discretionary federal spending by the U.S. government. It is a very small amount relative to the good it can do, and quite importantly, to the trust it can rebuild with the international community about the U.S.'s commitment to trying to at least move forward on this global challenge. So I think if we could find a path to try to bring some more support, financial support, to the Green Climate Fund through Congress, that would be something very specific. And I do think that is something that we could find bipartisan voices to support. The second point, just to echo and reiterate this very interesting proposal that's been put on the table this morning in a bipartisan way with large U.S. multinationals, with senior Republicans speaking out forcefully for it, this idea of a carbon dividend proposal. And I think to the extent that you and your colleagues on the other side of the aisle can begin to organize some hearings, some briefings to discuss the merits, the details of what this proposal could look like, would be an incredibly valuable contribution that we could make to move this conversation forward. And again, before I close, I want to thank you, Ranking Member, for your leadership on this such an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, obviously, we would wish for more bipartisan approach here, and it's not perhaps for me, respectfully, as a foreign ambassador here, to tell you how to do that. But a couple of messages I would like to leave you with. One is we need American leadership. We need American engagement. I mean, we will go ahead even if America withdraws from the Paris Agreement. But frankly, it'll be the weaker for that, and we would regret that. And particularly from a European perspective, since you're our closest friend, our closest partner, our closest ally, we would deeply regret that the U.S. would somehow drop out of this process, because you are needed on every level: the scale of your economy, the scale of your emissions, I'm afraid, but also your leadership. And I hope that this can be recognized. The other point, which I think is important, is that there is a certain pervasive sense that somehow the U.S. is at the losing end of all of this. I mean, I hope what's been clear by what's been said today, by what's been said about what China and India are doing, by what I have said about what the European Union is doing, other countries are delivering. They are not free riders on this, on some very generous activity of the United States. 50% of the Green Climate Fund that Commissioner referred to comes from the European Union member states. And we're also trying to find ways to fill the gap that will be left by the US. So this is not something where the United States is being left to carry the burden alone. Quite the contrary. There's a very strong collective effort. Now, some of it is not altruistic. It is not about saving the planet. It's about economic self-interest. It's about national self-interest, security self-interest. For whatever reason, we actually do have, as Christina said, this very exciting momentum of global cooperation, and it's a virtuous circle in which the United States, in my view, stands to benefit hugely, separately from the perhaps more contentious debate about climate change and how much the extent to which it's caused by humans or whatever. But this is a movement which is happening now, and the U.S. has every interest in being fully engaged and in continuing to provide the kind of leadership we've seen in recent times.
Thank you very much. Let me again thank all of you for taking your time out to come. This has been very stimulating to me, and I hope to all of those who've attended. We recognize that we're not where we'd like to be in working together in Congress to address these issues, but I'm not interested in giving up. I believe that we will attempt to move forward, attempt to spread the information. Your time here has been well spent, I believe, and we will make sure that this report is circulated. I believe that there's no other subject any more important to the future of our country and the world, working in lockstep to achieve some of the things that have been already decided would be the reasonable achievements. And I will now declare that the roundtable has concluded. Thank you very much.